Let's talk genocide. No. Seriously, let's talk genocide. Which genocide, I hear you ask? Well, this genocide is happening, as Oasis sang, right here, right now. Do you know what I mean? Let's talk about the fact that over 1 million Uighur Muslims are currently detained indefinitely in re-education camps across Xinjiang province in China. Now, what's the background to this whole thing, I hear you ask? Well, here's the problem. It's very complicated. You see, up until 1949, the ethnic minorities living in Xinjiang enjoyed some level of autonomy and independence. China's big, really big.
Big league.
Big league. Big league.
And I think we're going to make it big league.
Big league. Big league. And that's what's happened. Big league.
Big league.
Big league. And we're going to win big league.
And China is home to lots of people. Lots of people.
Big league.
And as the years went by, the Chinese government began to realize that the West was totally distracted and preoccupied by the Cold War and then Pokemon and then keeping up with the Kardashians. It began to figure out a way of exerting more and more control over Xinjiang province, just like it did in Tibet. This continued in 2017 when Xi Jinping gave a speech regarding all ethnic minorities and religious groups in China when he said, and I quote, that each religion must be Chinese in orientation and be adapted to socialist society. But things got worse. Within a year, the Central Communist Party had rolled out the world's most sophisticated and developed surveillance system, which they claimed was meant to monitor criminal activity. But in reality, when you add up the numbers, in Xinjiang province there are currently 20 million CCTV cameras. That's twice the number of the entire population of Uighur Muslims. To make it worse, they decided to call it Skynet. Skynet. Of all the names you could have chosen, you went for Skynet. Yeah, Terminator 2. Now, you may have seen certain drone footage that shows bound and shackled prisoners being loaded, literally herded into trains and moved to God knows where. Now, in question about this, the Chinese government said it's just a routine prisoner transfer that every other country goes through.
Right.
Now, in an awkward, perhaps cringeworthy interview on the BBC with Andrew Marr, China's ambassador to the UK had the following to say about this footage.
I cannot see, the population in Xinjiang increased to double. The population doubled. So there's no so-called restriction of the population. There's no so-called forced abortion and so on.
And the truth shall set you free!
Alright, bear with me. Let's get this straight. This means to say that if you see a population increasing in a certain area, that is clear, indisputable evidence there's no genocide. Whereas if you see the population decreasing in a certain area, that's evidence of genocide. I know. Here's an idea. Did you know that the UK's Jewish population has been steadily decreasing since 1990? That must mean there's a Jewish genocide here in the UK. Illuminati confirmed. And the scandal just gets worse. In the last few weeks, Disney was taken to task for filming its live remake of Mulan, that classic cartoon, because we can't think of new ideas, we just refilm everything as a live action. They were taken to task for filming most of it in Xinjiang province itself, and not only that, it gets worse. You see at the end of the film, in the credits section, Disney thanks the security services of Xinjiang province for allowing them to film Mulan there and then. The same security services who are at the same time busy rounding up millions of Uighur Muslims and throwing them in concentration camps.
Who's the leader of the front to take for you and me?
And that's not all. Just a few weeks ago, you may have seen this erupting on Twitter. The New York Post posted an article that claimed that Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, was involved in investment in a firm in China called Megvii. It turns out that this firm is a software company that's helping develop programs and software and hardware for that Skynet surveillance system. But that's still not all. You see, it gets even worse. In the last week of October, human rights lawyer Emma Riley became a whistleblower when she exposed the fact that her superiors at the United Nations in the Human Rights Department had been busy handing over names of Uyghur dissidents to the Chinese authorities. Now, I'm sure you can imagine. I mean, here's a piece of trivia for you. How surprised are you to hear how many United Nations sanctions or even condemnations have been passed against the Chinese government's actions? That's right, 0. Oh, but SodaStream opens one factory in the West Bank and everyone loses their minds. There's no end to it. And here are the questions. Why has the world been so silent in the face of what is almost certainly real and true genocide? And second to that, do we as Jews who've experienced genocide in living memory, do we have like an added responsibility or a moral duty to be doing much, much more? And finally, many are calling for a widespread boycott of Chinese products. And I wonder, in Judaism, is there a precedent for boycotts and for sanctions? Is there anything in Jewish literature or Torah literature that supports such an approach? We're joined by David and Justin to explore just how complicated this situation is and how we can do much more to solve it. David, if I could start with you and ask really to clue us in on what's actually going on the ground in China at the moment. And second to that, which I think a lot of people are wondering about, is what is the Chinese government's official stance corresponding to what's being reported, not enough, in Western media?
Some commentators have made the argument that what's driving this is a shift in Chinese policy away from a pluralist approach to China's various minorities to something which people describe as Han-Chinese supremacism. And there is substantial evidence that right from the top, the policy is to impose a Han-Chinese framework on all minority groups. I mean, remember, China is a country that really, the most terrifying thing from the point of view of any Chinese administrator is that China loses control of its vast population, the huge area of land that China controls. And China regards other cultures, other movements, other religions as a challenge to the authority of the Chinese Communist Party. And this is a one-party state, and this is how one-party states operate.
And it is deeply concerning, of course, that there is such a disparity between what's really going on and how much we know about it and how much is being reported. Justin, if I could ask you, I think the Jewish News rightly earned its plaudits for becoming the first, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think still is the only mainstream British newspaper to have made this story or to have seen this story as being worthy of front page news. And the Jewish News Group received a lot of praise for this. Can you take us through the decision-making process behind that decision to say, enough's enough, we're putting this on the front page?
I mean, you're right. This situation, what many people would see as a genocide at its worst, has not got the coverage nationally, internationally, that it ought to have done. We've got lots of big international stories at the moment, the American presidency, the COVID crisis and so on. And certainly this at no point has received the coverage that it ought to have done. I think for us at the Jewish News, although we are getting plaudits, as you say, for drawing attention to what's going on, if anything, I would say we were quite slow to pick it up and to give it the prominence that it ought to have had, because there has long been these images in the international media of those camps with the barbed wire and the fencing and so on that alerted the world to the scale of what's going on here, and that carries certain echoes for people in the Jewish community. But I think it was the revelation that tons of hair had been discovered, believed to have been taken from members of the Uyghur community and then transported to America, that really alerted us to this as being something that the Jewish community of all communities ought to be drawing attention to as much as possible.
So again, a twofold question. Is there disappointment at perhaps the speed at which this campaigning is moving and the response to the campaigning? And secondly, perhaps more depressingly, Are we too far gone?
I mean, I agree that it is not an easy thing to have something specifically declared a genocide, nor should it be, because these are grave charges that can only really be made on the basis of the clearest and most rigorously substantiated evidence. And part of the problem is getting enough clear evidence that gives us a full picture of exactly what is going on in Xinjiang province. So, I'm not disappointed that there hasn't been an immediate declaration of genocide. I would be disappointed if these were issues that were not kept under constant review. But I'd like to move on to the second part of the question, which I think is a very important one, which is why is it that so few governments have been prepared to speak out? And the answer, as we know, is that if you criticize China, as Canada did in relation to not just the treatment of the Uyghurs, but other issues. Australia putting out a report in relation to Chinese culpability for the growth of the COVID crisis in the early days, for example. China will punish you. Now, if you are a large country like the United Kingdom, that shouldn't be something that should concern you. There are other markets, there are other suppliers. We are not economically reliant on China.
If I can wrap up, I think, with a closing thought from you both. Justin, obviously the Jewish news is within the Jewish community and certainly expanding its influence outside the Jewish community as well. You do have a powerful and strong voice. It's a respected voice in the community. What would your message be, not just obviously to our Jewish listeners, but to all listeners, all viewers? What would your message be in terms of what more we can do at a grassroots level to start addressing this issue?
There are actions that ordinary people can take, which, if done in a widespread way, would make a real difference. What we've called on politicians to do at a parliamentary level was to kind of push for actual sanctions against both state and non-state players, and look at other ways that action can be taken to put pressure on the Chinese government. And we launched a petition which gained 150 or so signatures from MPs and peers. And that, together with Nusrat Ghani, who helped us with that initiative, that's going to be presented to the Prime Minister in the coming days and weeks. So we're a relatively small Jewish community newspaper. I'm not sure how much impact we alone will have, but I do know that within this country, the coverage that we've given, because we're a Jewish community paper standing up for a Muslim minority community, has really gained a lot of traction, has been noticed by other faith communities, including the Church of England, and has compelled people to speak out. It was only after our coverage that various Holocaust organisations in the UK started talking more about this issue and started writing opinion pieces in the national media. And if we've had that impact, we can only be pleased.
There are absolutely things that could be done. They do need to be done, but they only can really be done effectively at a governmental level. And that, I think, is where most of our efforts ought to be directed.
David, you'd imagine at this point also that the additional complication for the government, not that it's any justification, or I would for 1 minute argue against that kind of action, but at a time when we're struggling to gain a trade deal with Europe, we've got an American president who's not exactly in favour of Brexit. We rule out China as well, where we're going to start to struggle if you're a minister looking at the situation.
Right, yes, and of course that's the case, but bear in mind that, irrespective of the consequences economically, irrespective of whether they are certain to move China or not, in this country we do, to some degree at least, make policy according to moral principles. And since Britain led the world in abolishing and then enforcing the abolition of the slave trade, we have taken the position that it is improper for people in Britain to profit from the proceeds of slavery. And that's essentially where we are. We can either be a country that lets people profit from slavery, or we can stick to our principles and say, there is a line here and we do not cross it.
A huge thank you to you, David, from Quilliam, and to you, Justin, from the Jewish News. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us, and for a really interesting, engaging discussion. And we really hope this discussion is just the beginning of something much, much bigger. Thank you so much for joining us. I think what this boils down to is a complicatedly simple question, which is how much are we, on an individual level, prepared to sacrifice for the well-being of people the other side of the globe who we're probably never even going to meet? There seems to be a growing number of people who are saying that the correct approach to this is to simply blanket boycott all goods and products made in China, which kind of means most of our homes. Actually, the other week, a colleague of mine was asking around for people's advice, and she was saying, what's the best mobile phone on the market that isn't produced or made in China? The reason being she wanted to sort of wean her family off relying on Chinese-made goods. But I wonder, is there actually a basis for widespread boycott in Jewish thought? Now the part you've all been waiting for, the Torah Perspective. Perhaps the most famous recent example of like a halachic Jewish law-based boycott was in 2018 when a group of 60 rabbis, it's a hell of a long sermon, they got together and they signed this letter in response to an expose that was documented on Australian TV. And this undercover documentary showed that a number of companies that kosher Israeli companies were using to import livestock from overseas were practicing the most horrendous conditions for animals on these freight ships. So much so that on one shipment, 2,400 sheep died and were simply tossed overboard into the ocean. Now, these rabbis got together and they essentially said, enough's enough. We're signing this letter, we're boycotting these companies, and you know something incredible? It works. On the other hand, some people argue quite convincingly that we in the West are far too reliant on Chinese-made products to be able to go cold turkey made in China and give them up entirely. I need my stereo, I need my earphones, I want my laptop, I want my television, I want it now, I want the whole world. How are we meant to give up something that our whole lives and way of living depends on? And the second point they make is one that perhaps carries a little bit more severity, and that is most movements surrounding boycotts end in disaster. Not for the governments responsible, not for the multinational corporations responsible, no, not for them, but for that poor individual on the street. That worker who's struggling to make ends meet to put bread on the table. They're just trying to make a living.
I want some more.
Okay, so maybe boycotts are not the most realistic and practical approach at the moment, but at the very least, do we have a moral duty and responsibility to at least speak up in defense of the Uighur Muslims? It should be quite straightforward, right? It says, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," love your fellow like yourself. Which Rabbi Akiva, the Second Temple sage, said quite clearly, Zeh klal gadol b'Torah. This is the most important principle in the whole Torah. So it's straightforward, it's self-explanatory. Love your fellow like yourself. Not so simple. On the one hand, it's not clear who your fellow is actually referring to. Like, who is that? Is that the person who shares similar viewpoints and backdrop to me? Is it a person who has a similar culture to me? Is it a person who shares similar values to me? Is it my next door neighbor? Is it the guy I don't like? The guy who I didn't like in school? The guy who I hate at work? Is it the whole world? Are we obliged to love the entire world like ourselves? And if that's the case, what turns out in a very strange turn of events is that we're actually obligated to love the Chinese government as much as we love the Uighur Muslims. It doesn't make sense and it doesn't work. Now, fortunately, to find a way out of this complicated mess, the Tanaic Second Temple sage Hillel, he stepped in and he reworked and reverse engineered this entire principle. And he looked at that line that says, love your fellow like yourself, and he realized how is that even possible and applicable in day-to-day life. And he reworked it to say, Ma desanei lach lechavrach al ta'aseh. You got that, Emperor Palpatine?
You have been well trained, my young apprentice.
Good. Now that bit's in Aramaic. What it means in plain English is simply, that which you hate when done to yourself, do not do to others. So Hillel looked at this line and realized, if we change this from this vague, far too broad definition of loving everyone like you love yourself, and actually tone that down a bit, and say if something were to happen to you, and it would cause you pain and suffering, and you would hate that action done to you, think about that action and never do it to someone else. And now suddenly we're on much more familiar terrain. Because you see, it wasn't so long ago that we recognized and marked the 82nd anniversary of Kristallnacht. That was a night where the Nazi government ran one of the most complex and complicated social science experiments in history. And we know from internal writings and communiques between Himmler and Hitler that what was going on that night was an experiment to see, if we do such and such to the Jews, how will the world react? And it was the fact that the world responded with a deafening silence that gave the Nazi Party carte blanche to carry on with their program of mass extermination, the final solution. And so when the Nazis herded the Jewish population of Europe into ghettos, the world remained silent. And when they liquidated those ghettos and sent those Jews to the concentration camps, the world remained silent. And when they sent the prisoners of those concentration camps one by one to their end in the gas chambers, the world remained silent. We've heard silence before. We know, perhaps more than any nation on earth, silence hurts. We've been there. We've lived through it. We've died through it. And as Hillel said, that which you've experienced that brings you pain and suffering, that which you've experienced that you hate, l'chavrach al ta'aseh, don't do the same thing to other people. So at the very least, let's not remain silent. We're blessed to live in a society where we have a voice and where that voice is heard and listened to, unlike the Uyghur Muslims, and in fact, unlike the majority of the Chinese population. Let's use that voice. Let's break this silence. Let's talk about genocide. Let's talk politics. No, seriously, let's talk politics. You may have noticed, unless you've been living in a cave for the past month, that a certain presidential election just took place in the United States of America. Now, things got very complicated very quickly. You see, the current incumbent president, Donald Trump, so far hasn't conceded the election to his rival and challenger, Joe Biden.